Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Woodrow Wilson, and the focus is 14 points and victory. The year is 1918. World War I is certainly underway. The Allied nations, the Central Powers, they had been in this to win it from the very beginning. For Woodrow Wilson, he had gone from a position of peace without victory to now getting his country into the fight. He was certainly in it to win, but with a purpose. For Woodrow Wilson, this had become his purpose, to make World War I the war to end all wars, to figure out a way to prevent these kinds of clashes from happening in the future. So while the mobilization is still going on, he had Colonel Edward House and a handful of his close colleagues put together a group. They called it the Inquiry. They started to brainstorm what would the post-World War I world look like, and they started to come together with their ideas in January of 1918 that the president presented to the United States Congress. His answer to win the peace was going to be his 14 points. He introduced the thought that what is at stake now is the peace of the world. What we are striving for is a new international order based upon broad and universal principles of right and justice. No mere peace of shreds and patches. Unless each of these 14 points are dealt with in a spirit of unselfish and unbiased justice, with a view to the wishes, the natural connections, the racial aspirations, the security and the peace of mind of the peoples involved, no permanent peace will have been attained. This was not about crushing the enemy. This was about preventing future wars. So you got to win this one to prevent those in the future, if these points could be adopted. The first 5 of the 14 points were some general principles. No more secret treaties, free trade, decrease armaments, self-determination. This principle is incredibly important to Wilson, that the people on the land in which they live should be deciding their own government, their own allegiances. And that principle led into the points 6 through 13. This was generated to handle specific territories, countries, colonies. Wilson advocating on what to do for a number of those areas, but all of this was netted together for the key point of all, Wilson's 14th point, which he said was a general association of nations that must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. He called it the League of Nations. Now, for Wilson, he was not the first to embrace this concept. In fact, there had been a concept called the League to Enforce Peace that had been around for about the last 3 or 4 years. And in fact, Wilson's predecessor, William Taft, was the president of that organization, trying to foster many of these same principles. And he had a number of Republicans on board with him. Elihu Root and even Henry Cabot Lodge were in favor of this concept that William Taft had been pushing. Well, now the president, Woodrow Wilson, had made this all of his own. This international organization to put in place, settle disputes short of going to war. This was the key item for Woodrow Wilson in order to win the peace after they win the battlefield. Not much was going to matter, though, if they didn't win that fight. And the spring offensive was launched by the Germans and the Central Powers in March of 1918, and it made some real significant gains. In fact, the Allies fell back to a line about 60 miles outside of Paris. People were thinking maybe the Germans were right to go to unrestricted submarine warfare, that the Americans could not mobilize in time. Maybe the Americans would be too late to getting into the fight. Now, that was true for the land war, but for the Navy of the United States, there had already been some successes. They were able to slow down the destructive nature of those German submarines. Did it with 2 methods. The first was to use destroyers from the U.S. Navy to escort other ships. This would keep the submarines a little bit further away, much harder for them to perform their destructive torpedo action. The other thing the American Navy did was to lay thousands and thousands of mines in German waterways, right where those subs often transited. So that also made it dangerous for them to move forward. So that was going fairly well, but the Army for the United States still being mobilized, not ready for combat, probably still a couple of months away. In the meantime, President Wilson was dealing with some domestic challenges. Civil rights and women's rights were front and center. Many blacks in the United States wanted to fight, but they wanted to fight in an integrated military. But this was no chance under Woodrow Wilson. After all, Wilson had already segregated a couple of federal agencies. He was hardly going to go about desegregating the military, so blacks would be welcome in, but not to fight side by side with whites. They would be in their own units, and in fact, many in support roles, less in combat roles. But there were other problems going on domestically domestically with respect to this, because while they wouldn't fight together in Europe, blacks and whites were being housed together in training camps, including in the South. And this was causing a lot of angst from Southern whites. Lynchings, race riots, these were on the rise, and people were advocating to Woodrow Wilson to say something. The president should put an end to this. And for a while, Wilson was balking. He didn't think that the president actually had a role in putting something like this down. But eventually, he agreed. July 26th of 1918, he made a speech to direct this issue. He said that there have been many lynchings, and every one of them has been a blow at the heart of ordered law and humane justice. Every American who takes part in the action of a mob or gives it any sort of countenance is no true son of this great democracy, but its betrayer, and does more to discredit her by that single disloyalty to her standards of law and of right than the words of her statesmen or the sacrifices of her heroic boys in the trenches can do to make the suffering peoples believe her to be their savior. This was the most aggressive, forceful civil rights address that Woodrow Wilson had ever given. Didn't do much good. Not a lot of people listened, and he didn't do anything to back it up beyond this speech. So a lot of those problems would continue. As for women's rights, women were critical to the war effort. Their job was to come out of the home, fill the factories, take on all those jobs that the American volunteers and draftees were now vacating to go fight in Europe. Somebody had to go run those factories and make the American economy go. But the women, many of them wanted something now in return. They wanted the right to vote. Many states, or several states I should say, had already granted women the right to vote, but there was no national movement yet that had been authorized to allow women access to the franchise across the country. For that, they needed a constitutional amendment. And to this point, Woodrow Wilson had not supported that effort. Earlier in his presidency, he said suffrage for women will make absolutely no change in politics. It is the home that will be disastrously affected. Somebody has to make the home, and who's going to do that if the women don't? That was earlier in his presidency. Now he's also talking about why he's not supporting it, because he doesn't think it's a federal issue. According to Wilson, I am tied to the conviction, which I have had all my life, that changes of this sort ought to be brought about state by state. Well, suffragists started showing up at his home, the White House, and protesting on a daily basis. And Wilson's attitude to this was say, fine, let them protest. I'm mostly going to ignore this. But then things get a little bit closer to home for Wilson. And people say, oh, politics is all local. Well, Wilson's own family, his daughters, started to advocate within the home for this constitutional amendment for the women's right to vote. Congress was dealing with this issue as well. In fact, the House of Representatives voted on such amendment, and it passed. It reached the two-thirds supermajority in the House by one vote. But it was going to be tougher in the Senate. People were entrenched where they were. It was pretty clear that they were 2 votes short in the Senate. So Wilson's daughters, his son-in-law, who happened to be the Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, among those who were encouraging Wilson, look, if anybody's going to go get 2 votes to change, sir, it is you. Use your oratory. Go to the Senate, make a speech, see if you can get this thing over the top. So Wilson said, okay, I'll make the speech. And he said that the world was looking to the great, powerful, famous democracy of the West to lead them to the new day. And they think, in their logical simplicity, that democracy means that women shall play their part in affairs alongside men and upon an equal footing with them. He was advocating the Senate to give their authority to pass this constitutional amendment. He was unsuccessful. There was no change. They fell 2 votes short. Now, this amendment would pass on Woodrow Wilson's watch, but not for another 2 years. In the meantime, overseas, the American soldiers were finally coming online. First contact with the enemy, May 28, 1918. About 3,500 American soldiers fighting near with the French alongside. The Cantigny was the battlefield, and it was a major success for the Americans and the French combined to get that victory. It took them only about a half an hour to get that win. A big boost to morale, not only to the Americans, but frankly to the Allies, because now they were starting to see these American boys are coming really here to fight, and this is going to help us win. The American sector, remember, the Americans were going to fight primarily in their own units, under their own officers, their own flag. They were assigned the sector from Verdun to Belfort. Their job was to help check the Germans and then counterattack to push the Germans back toward Germany. Well, they did stop the German progress at the Battle of Belleau Wood. That was on July the 18th. Then they started pushing the Germans back. The Battle of Amiens, the Somme, Argonne Forest, the Battle of St. Michel, all of these victories, one after another, the Americans helping the Allies continue to push the Germans back throughout the summer of 1918. But this was costly. 5 months of hard fighting for the Americans cost them 116,000 dead, about half to disease. There was a global flu pandemic going on in the midst of World War I, so about half of those lost to disease, 116,000 killed, 204,000 wounded. But the Germans were actually facing a much worse situation because they were suffering similar size losses, but they had no way to replenish them. The men or materiel, Germany was basically spent, whereas the Americans were showing up with 10,000 new fresh soldiers every single day. Well, at the end of that summer, Bulgaria was the first of the Central Powers to fall, suing for peace in September of 1918, followed by Turkey, then Austria-Hungary, and even on October the 6th, Germany started to seek an armistice, reached out to the Americans and President Wilson, agreeing to an armistice on his 14 points. After all, that was probably the best deal that they were going to get. But the Allies and Wilson, too, were not quite ready to make this agreement. They didn't trust the Germans, and frankly, the Germans had yet to vacate all of the territory that it had acquired, and until they had either done that or at least committed to doing that, there would be no truce. In the meantime of all of this, the Americans were going to the polls for the midterm elections. This is early November of 1918. Now, Woodrow Wilson's not on the ballot, but he decided not to be silent. He urged the American public to send Democrats to Washington, D.C. in this next Congress. He said that the leaders of the minority, Republicans, have unquestionably been pro-war, but they have been anti-administration. At almost every turn since we entered the war, they have sought to take the choice of policy and the conduct of the war out of my hands and put it under the control of instrumentalities of their own choosing. The return of a Republican majority to either house of the Congress would, moreover, certainly be interpreted on the other side of the water as a repudiation of my leadership. He made it personal, he was advocating, and this completely backfired. This was politicizing the war effort in the eyes of many Americans, and he was strongly criticized for it. Whether this was the catalyst for the big loss in the midterms or not, certainly maybe a part of it, but the Republicans actually won both houses of Congress, and this was going to be critical, particularly in the Senate, because the Senate was going to have to approve any peace treaty that the Americans would be part of. Well, they were about to have that chance, because just after the polls closed in the United States, the Germans requested a meeting on the train of the Supreme Allied Commander of the Allies, Marshal Ferdinand Foch. They met. Hardly a friendly meeting. This was very, very tense. Basically, there was no negotiations, and a complete demand of the Germans to lay down their arms if they wanted to have an armistice. 72 hours or else the fighting would start again. Well, the Kaiser, Wilhelm, finally agreed that the battle was up. He abdicated his leadership in Germany and spent the rest of his life in Holland. Germany formed a republic under Fredrich Ebert, who was the chancellor, and Ebert was the one who agreed to the terms of the armistice, 5 a.m. on November the 11th. In fact, they ordered the ceasefire for that day at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of the year. Colonel House was the one who was able to cable back to the White House with the good news. Autocracy is dead, he wrote. Long live democracy and its immortal leader. In this great hour, my heart goes out to you in pride, admiration, and love. Edith Wilson had this reaction because she was asked oftentimes, how did you react? Well, many persons have asked me what we did, and all I can answer is we stood mute, unable to grasp the full significance of the words of the war coming to an end. The American troops were celebrating, the American people were celebrating, the war had been won. Now the hard part for Woodrow Wilson, and that was to win the peace on his terms. But that's the story for another day. That is Woodrow Wilson and 14 Points and Victory from the life of Woodrow Wilson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.